Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Hello, Paul Barter here again with another Reinventing Transport episode. My focus this time is, could mass car ownership melt away without draconian policies? That was the title of an essay I wrote in 2011. And never published, unfortunately. But before I talk about that, I first want to quickly share some background. In August last year, 2018, I emailed Chris Bradshaw to ask him onto this podcast. I wanted to ask him to share some of the highlights from his life's work, and we were spoiled for choice. Chris was a long-time employee of the planning department at the regional municipality of Ottawa-Carleton in Canada. He was a community relations officer, and his community-mindedness extended way beyond his work. For example, he was also co-founder of OttaWalk, which is an example of that rare beast, an active pedestrian advocacy group. He also co-founded PedNet, which was North America's first pedestrian rights coalition. He co-founded Ottawa's first car-sharing business. But most importantly to me, Chris was extremely thoughtful and full of visionary ideas about cities and urban transport. He was an active and generous participant in Sustran Discuss, which was an email discussion group I started in the late 1990s, and which had its heyday in the early 2000s. Chris was not hugely famous, but I always found him a great inspiration. So Chris replied promptly to my email, but he said that he was extremely unwell. It was a rare kind of cancer, he said. He was hopeful that surgery would help and said that being on the podcast would be a good thing to do as he recovered. So I wished him well and made a note to get back to him later. I followed up later in the year, but I got no answer. You will have guessed where this is going. I searched online, and sadly I found news that Chris died on the 3rd of November 2018 at the age of 74. So this episode is a tribute to Chris Bradshaw of Ottawa. He lived a most excellent life. It was actually Chris who asked me to write the essay that I'm going to share. It was going to be for a special edition he was editing for the journal of a well-known Canadian environmental group. The journal edition eventually fell through, unfortunately. The title of Chris's draft introductory essay gives you an idea of the focus. His title was Making Do with Fewer Cars, Using Metered Access to Shared Cars, MASK, to Avoid the Coming Global Car Population Explosion. So he coined that phrase, metered access to shared cars, MASK. It hasn't caught on, but I quite like it, to capture a whole family of ways of accessing cars. But anyway, I want to share with you some of the key ideas from my essay for Chris. As I said, the title was, Could Mass Car Ownership Melt Away Without Draconian Policies? I'll also make some new comments here and there because a lot has changed since 2011. Even so, I think some of the ideas are still relevant, and I hope it will make for interesting listening. Here goes. In the introductory essay in this volume, Chris Bradshaw suggests that his vision of mass uptake of metered access to shared cars should arrive organically, since the heavy hand of government would provoke public resentment and resistance. Is such an organic transition realistic? Could a mass shift away from private motor vehicle ownership happen without draconian and unpopular impositions by policymakers? Although the scenario discussed in this volume, by which I meant the whole edition that Chris was editing, although the scenario may seem at first far-fetched, I will argue that it is much more than mere wild speculation. Plausible social, economic and business trends may indeed provide a significant push in the right direction. A policy push is almost certainly also necessary, but it may not need to be heavy-handed or involve the trampling of individual choice. Some of this push can come from other policy agendas pursued for reasons that have nothing to do with car ownership or metered access to shared cars. But some impetus will come from explicitly aiming to escape automobile dependence and at promoting the rise of alternatives. I will argue that these do not need to be unacceptably interventionist. A policy push to help us escape the trap of car dependence would also arguably be enhancing of personal choice, rather than restricting freedom. So next section, the shift we are talking about. Before proceeding to discuss how it might come about, I would first like to be a little more explicit about the shift that I envisage. It is broadly in line with the vision explained by Chris Bradshaw in the introductory essay of this volume, sadly never published. It involves the emergence of an attractive alternative to the car-owning lifestyle. This alternative would be centred on an integrated package of mobility options. This package includes transit, but goes far beyond it to include ubiquitous metered access to shared cars, mask, among others. It is a shift in lifestyles and not merely a change in day-to-day mobility choices. It involves a gradual but significant shift in how excellent mobility is obtained and framed, so that eventually most people see excellent mobility as best achieved via access to a rich integrated tapestry of services, including cars, mostly accessed on a shared and/or fee-for-service basis rather than via mass individual ownership. So, as an aside, back to 2019, clearly lots of people have been thinking along these lines, people like Robin Chase and the founders of Mass Global, Mobility as a Service ideas. There's many people have been thinking along these lines. So here's me thinking along those lines in 2011. I was by no means the first. Back to the essay. For highly motorised societies, this will mean a reduction in the number of private motor vehicles. For newly motorising societies, it means a shift in trend lines, but may still involve some increase in car and motorcycle numbers. Privately owned cars will probably still play a role for certain groups of people and for rural dwellers. However, such cars would no longer be the majority method for achieving excellent mobility. This vision will make our relationships with cars more provisional and less compulsory. Just as an aside, for a while I was playing around with these words and ideas and trying to find a way to capture this idea, and the word provisional appealed to me. Let's see if we can make it catch on, hey? Back to the essay. It is not a completely new vision, and a number of other authors have discussed something like it for more than a decade, most of them inspired by the notion of ambitious, scaled-up car sharing. And I cite a few sources here. So OECD 1997, Adams 1997, Monheim 2003, Top 2006, and Bradshaw 2007. The next few sections focus on the central question of the essay. Is an organic shift away from mass car ownership plausible without draconian government action? I first need to acknowledge that there are indeed formidable obstacles to the scenario. In many places, especially in North America, mass car ownership seems very deeply entrenched. Furthermore, many places that do not yet have mass car ownership seem set on a trajectory towards it. If we look at car ownership trends across many countries, a future with much lower levels of car ownership would at first glance seem unlikely, except as a distant possibility. Mass private ownership of cars involves self-reinforcing processes that tend to make car dependence become ever more entrenched. The process of accommodating large numbers of cars and facilitating their use has a path-dependent character, involving profound changes to transport infrastructure, the built form at several scales, streetscapes, urban regulations, the organisation of relevant professions, and various social norms and expectations. High use and ownership of cars can often be said to be locked in, so that no easy reversal of these changes is possible. So this situation has been labelled automobile dependence. Even in countries that do not yet have high levels of car ownership, many of the trends all seem in the wrong direction. There have been many efforts to stand up against the trend, but successes have been few. Car dependence also has a grip at the household and individual level for many people around the world, who have voluntarily locked themselves into car-oriented lifestyles. Their past choices, such as home location, have undermined their subsequent ability to use alternatives to cars. This contributes to the political difficulty of reducing automobile dependence. Car owners often come to see their car use as almost compulsory. So many readers, in this case listeners, may therefore be sceptical of the potential for metered access to shared cars becoming a central part of an attractive alternative to car ownership for the masses. After all, car sharing for now seems to serve a rather small niche. There are also formidable obstacles to having taxis play a stronger role in many cities, too many of which are trapped in a broken regulatory framework that caps taxi numbers and turns taxi licenses into a tradable asset. Of course, this was before the rise of ride-hailing or ride-sourcing services such as Uber, Grab, Ola, Didi, Lyft, etc., etc. And of course, 2011 was long before people were thinking about scenarios around automated vehicles or autonomous vehicles or driverless cars, such as Robin Chase's heaven or hell scenarios, the hell scenario being the privately owned autonomous vehicle scenario, and the heaven scenario being a scenario in which autonomous cars and autonomous transit vehicles are predominantly open to the public shared vehicles, which actually dovetails with some of the scenarios in this paper, in this essay, even though I hadn't dreamed of that possibility at that point. Transit systems in many cities are also structured and regulated in ways that inhibit innovation and the ability to rise to the occasion, even if car ownership was somehow to decline. Clearly, there is nothing inevitable about Bradshaw's scenario. Nevertheless, it would be hasty to dismiss the possibility. The rest of this essay offers perspectives that make change seem more plausible, perhaps even likely. Section is entitled Wider Forces That Might Push Us Towards Car-Light Mobility Scenarios. This section considers wider forces for radical change that originate beyond the transport system, but which could open market-based pathways for change in urban mobility without public policy playing a major role. The next section will then discuss policy agendas to reduce mass car ownership, and yet still avoid being seen as draconian. Wider forces beyond the urban transport arena which do not involve policy activism include disruptive changes in technology, in business, and in the economy. For example, a decade or more of deleveraging and deflation in the rich economies might make car ownership less affordable. Well, that hasn't happened. There has been deflation and deleveraging, but there's been a boom in loans for car ownership. A period with sustained high fuel and commodity prices is another possibility. And again, that hasn't happened. Simultaneously, a number of technological changes and business innovations may be poised to disrupt mobility systems and to enhance their capacity to respond to the pressures just mentioned. Continuing innovation in mobile communications and computing devices, smartphones, etc., telematics, and in social media are already threatening to disrupt numerous areas of business in inherently unpredictable directions. So this was just before the huge rise in apps and services via those apps. One such wave of innovation is especially relevant to this volume. This is the trend towards collaborative consumption and the closely related idea of a shift from products to services. Numerous new and transformed urban mobility services are prominent examples of this shift. They are beginning to weaken the perceived link between car use and car possession. I tend to use the word possession rather than ownership to take account of things like people who have a company car at home. They don't own it, but they possess it, and it for all intents and purposes, all of the behavioural issues are just like having your own car. And these trends are enhancing the prospects for developing an attractive and comprehensive alternative to having one's own car. Examples include car sharing, bicycle sharing, ride sharing, integration of public transport and its marketing, integrated mobility packages. There were a few pioneering examples of this in certain cities around the world even then. Car-free housing, parking unbundling, new pricing technologies, advances in vehicle telematics, and the emergence of transport information services delivered via apps on mobile devices. These latter initiatives may multiply the power of these various services by integrating them and unleashing network economies and complementarities for both users and providers. So you can see that there was a bit of excitement at that time. Many of us could see change coming, but we couldn't see exactly what changes were coming. The theme of this volume taps into this zeitgeist by proposing the mass uptake of metered access to shared cars, which would represent a dramatic scaling up of collaborative consumption in the urban transport arena. The buzz around this collaborative consumption shift suggests to many that it may be possible to make alternatives to ownership sufficiently convenient and compelling that a mass shift away from car ownership could indeed occur organically without government compulsion. It certainly seems possible that further innovation may make alternative mobility packages, in other words, mobility as a service kind of packages, more and more attractive. Possible examples include peer-to-peer, one-way and floating car share innovations. Such improvements might further expand the range of contexts in which the car-owning lifestyle faces a serious competitor. So as it's turned out, the car-sharing scene has been growing, but it hasn't been explosive. Much more significant has been the rise of ride-hailing, for example, and more recently micro-mobility shared services like dockless bike share, boom and bust, and now dockless scooter share, none of which was on the horizon at that point in 2011. I'll return to this topic later when I consider possible explicit government efforts to accelerate the process. Section, policies to melt automobile dependence without being heavy-handed. Now let's turn to policy. This section considers if policy might also assist the shift, but without being seen as too draconian. This may seem difficult, as experience tells us. Car-dependent households see policies that threaten their car use, and especially their car ownership, as unreasonable, since they often perceive much of their car use as compulsory and without palatable alternatives. Nevertheless, this section seeks to highlight several ways in which policy might be able to help melt car dependence and reduce the attractions of mass car ownership without provoking too strong a backlash. Some of these will be pursued for reasons that have little to do with our scenario, but which may nevertheless further it. Some will make the melting of automobile dependence the explicit goal. So policies pursued for other reasons. One possibility is that policies that gain support for other reasons might inadvertently also help erode automobile dependence. Important arenas for such policies outside urban transport policy include climate change policy and energy policy. Plausible reforms in these areas could strongly reshape incentives in urban mobility systems, for example by increasing the cost of fuel. Urban planning reforms aimed at various objectives, including public health, affordable housing, as well as energy and climate change, among others, may also be able to help erode the grip of automobile-dependent assumptions and regulations. Some of these also appear to be gathering momentum. The relevant urban planning reforms include reform of parking requirements, reforms to rigidly segregated low-density zoning practice, transit-oriented development efforts and suburban retrofits to intensify suburban sub-centres and strip malls. So in retrospect, yes, various of these reforms are happening in various places, but all too slowly for many of us. There are also several transport policy agendas that could assist the shift away from car ownership, even if pursued for other reasons. An enhanced environment for walking and cycling is being pursued in many places for various reasons, including public health and safety, clean air, livable streets, and enhanced accessibility for the elderly and people with disabilities. Momentum is also gathering for reform of road cost recovery policies for reasons that are unrelated to automobile dependence. These reasons include declining fuel tax receipts, local government financial strains, technological opportunities in telematics for road pricing, among others. Cost recovery reform could potentially have a profound impact. So I think I still agree with all of that, but it still is not happening very widely just yet. I have suggested that if the efforts mentioned above are pursued for the sake of goals that have widespread support, their inadvertent impact on the attractiveness of car ownerships may provoke less resistance than an explicit policy effort would. However, this may not always be enough. The fact that these policies target car ownership and usage only indirectly does not necessarily save them from the resistance associated with the politics of automobile dependence and the defence of cheap motoring by people who feel they lack alternatives. Therefore, before discussing more policy possibilities, I would like to take a detour to argue that challenging automobile dependence more directly may be getting easier politically. Perhaps we need not shy away from further direct assaults on it. Undermining the market credentials of automobile dependence is the next section. Many of the arguments both for and against action to erode car dependence make the assumption that these arrangements are primarily a market outcome, and that efforts against them must involve government constraints on individual freedom. This assumption is increasingly being disputed. In fact, evidence is mounting that much of the edifice of automobile dependence that supports mass car ownership was created and is kept in place only with the support of an extremely heavy hand from governments, especially at local level. So, for example, Levine, Lewin, and Ryan Avant, among others, highlight that it is zoning, not market preferences, that mostly reinforces low-density sprawl in North America. Donald Shoup and others have also highlighted that excessive and mostly free parking arises primarily from parking requirement regulations and other parking regulations. Similar regulatory forces prompt oversupply of parking in many countries. Many countries also have tax incentives or exemptions that favour low-density greenfield development, and of course, subsidised road investments that focus on easing congestion with capacity increases tend to promote sprawling development. So this idea that car dependence is not a market phenomenon is perhaps that argument is much more widely known now than it was in 2011. So I probably wouldn't need to labour that point so much if I was writing this essay now, or maybe I do. Furthermore, lock-in to automobile-dependent patterns itself often limits choices rather than expanding them. The era in which car-centric policy expanded individual choice is long gone for most countries. Policies that lock us deeper into car dependence have the effect of stifling choice and making cars ever more compulsory. Automobile dependence, at several scales, restricts the housing, neighbourhood and travel choices of individuals and households. This choice reduction is real, even if it initially arose voluntarily as individual decisions or via collective political agreements by communities, especially local governments. Car ownership itself can be argued to create distortion in the market of day-to-day travel, especially with cost structures dominated by fixed costs. It inhibits subsequent travel choice making to entrench overuse. This will sound odd if you think of car ownership as the normal way to achieve high mobility, but it makes more sense if we compare car ownership with the benchmark of a car-light lifestyle, with excellent, comprehensive multimodal mobility and with access to car-based mobility on a fee-for-service basis. This arrangement prompts users to make many more active decisions about which mode to use for which trips. So in other words, it seems strange to say that car ownership causes distortions in people's travel choices and behaviour, unless we have an alternative in which people can also choose cars if they want, but in which they are not faced with this distortion. They don't own their own car, they don't possess a car, so their travel choices are not distorted by that particular feature. Arguably, a shift away from mass car ownership could open up options that are otherwise cut off by the lock-in of automobile dependence. This perspective also suggests that lock-in to automobile dependence may not be as robust as it has seemed. If it is propped up more by regulation than by market preferences, then perhaps it is vulnerable to reforms to those regulations. This also opens the possibility that the active promotion of a shift towards mass metered access to shared cars and of the melting of automobile dependence could come to be seen as a way of enhancing choices and of reducing, not increasing, onerous impositions by government. I guess I'm making something like a market urbanism pitch here. Making auto-dependent structures face a market test is not coercion. It would allow market processes to open up richer choices and make it easier for everyone to express and realise their preferences. Choice-enhancing policy nudges to escape car dependence is the next section. So far in this essay, I have argued that major changes in the economy, the business world, and the broad policy context for urban mobility services may be able to help a shift away from mass car ownership towards a mask-centred set of alternatives, metered access to shared cars, MASK. The choice-destroying phenomenon of automobile dependence stands in the way. The grip of automobile-dependent trends may not be as tight as we have assumed, because it is propped up by out-of-date regulations that can be repealed, much more than by market preferences. Efforts to undermine automobile dependence should be seen as choice-enhancing. This section therefore focuses on policy possibilities that aim to facilitate, although not force, a melting of car dependence and a shift to car-light lifestyles. The emphasis is on policy approaches that offer some hope of being effective yet politically palatable, and avoid being heavy-handed. Many such agendas are already being pursued, of course. Here are a few examples. So just as an aside, you be the judge of whether I'm realistic here. Most jurisdictions could easily identify and purge or moderate subsidies and regulations that promote automobile dependence, yet have little clear benefit and narrow support. This would not eliminate culprits that still have widespread support, such as systematic underpricing of cars and car-oriented zoning, but it would be a start. We also need a stronger push to bring telematics-based services such as pay-as-you-go insurance to the vehicle fleet as a key pathway to accelerate the shift to distance-based road charging. And I was citing Bern Grush and his thinking on this in 2010. Bradshaw points out in this volume that such road user charging can be a key nudge towards metered access to shared cars by shifting fixed to variable costs. There may also be a case to deliberately set road user charges for personal household vehicles at a slightly higher rate than for metered access to shared car vehicles in order to explicitly focus attention on the distortion of traffic behaviour inherent in personal possession of a vehicle. Along similar lines, we might consider directly rewarding car-free households in recognition of their role in keeping alternatives to the private car viable, perhaps through a monthly lottery for which only car-free households are eligible. And I have to say that actually Chris disagreed with me on that. He said that that would raise the image of being car-free or car-light as some kind of sacrifice that you have to sort of be compensated for, whereas he wanted to argue that it has inherent advantages. There are many possibilities, but I would now like to focus on just two policy efforts that I believe have strong potential or a good claim to be choice-enhancing. The first is parking policy reforms that build on the proposals of Donald Shoup. Such reforms should work in a gradual, choice-enabling way to make investments in parking face more of a market test. This should allow a gradual decline in the massive oversupply of parking that currently exists in many places. It would make parking more expensive in precisely the places where alternatives are richest. It would also provide a boost for metered access to shared cars, which is thrifty in parking space per person served. So the second promising agenda is reform of mobility service industry structures and regulatory frameworks in order to foster combined mobility, as it's called by UITP, also called mobility as a service by various others, and thus boost the appeal, viability, and integration of metered access to cars, transit, and others. In order for an alternative package of mobility options to compete with car ownership successfully, each of its components needs to scale up and improve, and in addition, the package as a whole needs to become much more integrated so that it is attractive as a lifestyle choice. In most places, such improvements are beyond the capacities of existing regulatory arrangements and industry structures. For example, in many cities, there are institutional barriers that inhibit cooperation between transit operators, taxi services, and car-sharing operators. And today we could add the ride-hailing operators and the bike-sharing and scooter-sharing operators, etc. Furthermore, today's vertically integrated metered access to shared car services may not lend themselves to scaling up. Existing car share, taxi and car rental companies combine customer service, information and dispatch and fleet operations and compete with other similarly vertically integrated operators. For the customers of one car share company, access to the fleets of other companies is often difficult, expensive, or non-existent. This reduces the appeal of car sharing wherever there are competing operators, especially in low-density areas. So perhaps there is a case for a restructuring of metered access to shared car services to much more strongly encourage cross-fleet access. For example, this could be achieved with an arrangement in which customers deal with a mobility retailer, which has access to a common dispatch system, possibly government mandated, to enable easy access to the fleets of all competing fleet operators. Such an arrangement creates a new layer of mobility retailers or mobility brokers in the industry structure. So here I was sort of talking about what we now refer to as combined mobility or mobility as a service. Many of these same issues are important even now in 2019, the same dilemmas, perhaps in slightly different form. So it's interesting to look back to 2011, what I was talking about here. So these mobility retailers or mobility brokers would handle the retailing, marketing, and information end of your mobility needs, but would leave vehicle operations to fleet operators, which would probably be separate companies. Eventually, each city might have several mobility retailers in competition with each other. However, unlike the competition by today's car share companies, such competition would not limit your access to the whole range of mobility services. Such data-intensive mobility retailing companies have only recently become a much more realistic possibility for reasons that include advances in telematics and real-time urban mobility data sharing, the rise of smartphones and the emergence of new social network-based spatial mobility services such as ride-sharing and peer-to-peer car sharing. To reach such a scenario may not happen spontaneously, however. It may require some modest government assistance or regulation to achieve the transition. Section is called Possible Tipping Points and Synergies in the Melting Away of Automobile Dependence and Mass Car Ownership. Possible threshold effects and synergies may provide some further hope that our scenario for change may become possible without draconian policy impositions. For example, many of the alternatives to private cars, including metered access to shared cars, have network economies. Their convenience and attractiveness may increase dramatically if they can become sufficiently ubiquitous. There's also a political dimension to this threshold idea. Once the various alternatives to private car ownership reach a critical mass, it becomes more difficult to claim that cars are necessary when objecting to policies that resist auto-dependence. Ubiquitous metered access to shared cars especially undermines such claims, since even if you need to drive sometimes, you still don't necessarily need to have your own car to do so. Metered access to shared cars may also help erode the value of cars as positional goods that signal high status. We can also find cause for cautious optimism about such change by noting that there are already some places where a car-light or car-free lifestyle is chosen freely by significant numbers of affluent people who can clearly afford to own cars. Examples include the inner cities of various metropolises such as Paris, Tokyo, New York City, Hong Kong, Berlin, and many others. A shift away from mass car ownership for places that are currently strongly car-dependent is much less easy to imagine. Metered access to shared cars may need to play a much more central role in the transformation of more automobile-dependent places than in the inner cities. This is because these areas will still have trouble being served well by non-car modes. As mentioned earlier, peer-to-peer car sharing and other as-yet untested ideas, such as Chris Bradshaw's proposal for two-station car sharing, with some cars having a pod in residential areas at night and a pod in an employment district during the day, may help extend the appeal of metered access to shared cars into suburban contexts. So, by the way, there's an example of Chris Bradshaw's interesting, imaginative and visionary thinking. He was really was an ideas person. Nevertheless, this will be a challenge, since the current niche for metered access to shared cars is in the dense mixed-use areas. So, in 2019 again, this problem is still here, and despite the greatly enriched alternatives, it's still a problem that the alternatives to having your own car in a suburban automobile-dependent area are still considered not good enough by most car owners. So anyway, back to the essay, nearly finished. For newly motorising parts of the world, mass uptake of metered access to shared cars may be able to offer governments an attractive solution to the politics of disappointment over mobility aspirations. If continued mass motorisation is snatched away, even if only by circumstances, upwardly mobile people will need to be offered a quality alternative to the cars that they dreamed of owning. This is relevant to what's happening in Singapore, actually, and you may have listened to my episode about the Singapore story, warts and all, where something very similar to this has been happening in Singapore. In conclusion, even if some of the arguments here are necessarily speculative, they strongly suggest that a shift away from mass car ownership should not be hastily dismissed as a fantasy. An easily imagined set of external trends, wider policy agendas, and explicitly pro-metered access to shared car policies may make such an apparently implausible scenario possible. So that's where I ended. It was an optimistic and hopeful ending. It hasn't happened yet. I'm still hoping. Do you think it can happen? What did I miss? So, as I said, this episode was a tribute to Chris Bradshaw and his imaginative thinking on urban transport. We miss you, Chris. Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion, or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.